They were laughing before Ruth Callahan's boots had even found the platform boards, and she heard every word of it over the hiss of the departing train, because the women of 9 Mile had never learned to laugh quietly. "That's her," one of them said, not troubling to lower her voice at all. "That's the bride Wade Halloran sent all that way for." Another woman, stout and pink-faced under a bonnet trimmed with more ribbon than sense, pressed a gloved hand to her mouth as though the sight of Ruth standing there in her good gray traveling dress, her hair scraped back plain, her jaw set the way it got set when she meant not to cry in public, was more than good manners could bear. Poor Wade. I do hope he ordered a mule along with her, to carry all that plainness home. Ruth had been called plain before. She had grown up the middle daughter in a house with two sisters generally agreed to be prettier, had stood at the edges of dances back in Ohio, while men's eyes slid past her toward softer faces and smaller waists, and had made her peace with it the way a woman makes peace with whether she cannot change, by getting on with her day regardless. Her mother had died when Ruth was 16, and her father had remarried a woman who made it plain, in 100 small ways over the years, that a plain daughter with no dowry to speak of was a burden to be married off rather than a joy to be kept. And by the time Ruth turned 29 unmarried, the whole household had begun to look at her the way one looks at a debt come due. She had answered Wade Halloran's advertisement for a wife not out of desperation alone, though desperation had played its part, but because his letters had been plain themselves, honest about what he wanted and what he had to offer, with no flowery promises she'd have known better than to trust. He had written of his acres and his cattle and his hope for a partner rather than an ornament, had asked her real questions about her thoughts on hard winters and long silences, and whether she could keep her own counsel when a house sat 12 miles from its nearest neighbor. And she had answered every one honestly, and something in the plainness of that correspondence had felt, for the first time in longer than she could say, like being seen as a whole person rather than measured and found wanting. She had liked him for that, sight unseen, and had boarded the train west with more hope in her chest than she'd allowed herself in a decade. She had not expected to be laughed off the platform before she'd said a single word to him. She set her chin, picked up her one case, and walked toward the depot house as though the laughter were weather too, and it was there, rounding the corner of the platform, that she nearly collided with the man she recognized from the single photograph he'd sent, tall, sun-weathered, somewhere past 30, with the kind of steady gray eyes that did not, she noticed at once, look at her the way the women behind her had been looking. "Miss Callahan," he said, and took his hat off, which was more courtesy than anyone else on that platform had shown her. "Wade Halloran. I'd have met the train sooner, but my foreman's mare went lame, and I lost 20 minutes I can't get back." He glanced past her shoulder at the knot of women still watching, still not troubling to hide their amusement, and something tightened at the corner of his jaw that told Ruth he had heard every word they'd said as clearly as she had. "Ladies," he said, with a nod that was courtesy on its face and something considerably sharper underneath it, and the laughter behind them died down to whispering, which Ruth supposed was the best that could be hoped for from a town like 9 Mile on short notice. He was looking at her the way a man looks at a letter he has read so many times he half expects the words to have changed, searching, she thought, for some sign of the woman whose handwriting he'd come to know better than her face. Whatever he found seemed to satisfy him, because his shoulders eased a fraction, and he settled his hat back over hair gone dusty gold at the temples from years under an open sky. "You needn't have come at all, if you'd rather see what a poor bargain you made and send me back on the next train," Ruth said, because she had decided somewhere between Ohio and the territory that she would rather be plain-spoken than pitied, and if Wade Halloran meant to renege on his letters now that he'd seen her face, she'd rather hear it straight than have it dressed up kind. "I know what I look like next to what a man might hope for." I know what you look like too, Wade said. I've been looking at it since you stepped off that train, and near as I can tell, you look like a woman who traveled 2 weeks alone to marry a stranger and didn't flinch once when half the town decided to be cruel about it on sight. That's not nothing, Miss Callahan. That's considerably more than most people manage. He picked up her case before she could protest it, and offered his arm, which she took after only the smallest hesitation, and they walked past the women at the platform's edge together. And Ruth noted, with some private satisfaction, that not one of them found anything further to say once Wade Howerin had planted himself so plainly on her side of the argument. It should have ended there, or nearly there, but 9 Mile was not finished with her yet. Wade had arranged for her to take a room at the boarding house until the wedding, which by his letters was meant to happen within the week, proper banns and all, and it was there that Louisa Fenn found her before the noon hour was out. Louisa was, by every account Ruth gathered before ever laying eyes on her, the prettiest unmarried woman in 9 Mile, the daughter of the man who held the mortgage on half the town's businesses. And though no one said it outright, because no one needed to, the woman most of 9 Mile had expected Wade Howerin to marry, before he'd gone, and sent east for a stranger instead. I only wanted to welcome you properly, Louisa said, sweeping into the boarding-house parlor in blue silk that made Ruth's gray traveling dress look, by contrast, like something scraped off a poorhouse floor, which Ruth suspected was precisely the intended effect. It's such a curious thing, a man like Wade sending all that way for a bride when there are perfectly good women right here in 9 Mile who'd have had him gladly. I do hope you won't take it hard when I say the whole town's been placing wagers on how long you'll last before you see there's no place for you here and go on home. She smiled, sweet as spoiled milk. I'd hate to see you embarrassed further, is all. There's a stage back east Thursday. I could have Papa arrange your fare, if it would spare you the trouble of a wedding nobody here much wants to see happen. Mrs. Prout, who kept the boarding house and had listened to the whole exchange from the hallway without troubling to hide it, came in once Louisa had swept out again in a rustle of blue silk, and set down a cup of tea Ruth had not asked for but was glad of regardless. Don't you mind Louisa Fenn overmuch, the older woman said, settling herself uninvited into the room's one chair. Though I'll tell you plain, since somebody ought to, that there's more behind her sweetness than wounded pride. Her father Silas holds the note on the grazing lease Wade shares with the Tillman spread, the water rights that let his herd through a dry summer. And there's been talk a year or better that Silas meant Louisa to marry into that lease directly, rather than leave it to Wade's good sense to keep paying regular. A man sending east for a stranger instead of marrying the banker's daughter is a man who's put his whole herd's water at some risk, whatever his letters to you might have said about wanting a partner and not an ornament. I don't tell you this to frighten you off, mind. I tell you because you strike me as a woman who'd rather know the whole shape of a thing than be coddled about half of it. Ruth sat with that a long moment, turning the teacup in her hands. It was one matter to be laughed at for her face. It was another to learn that her marrying Wade Howerin might cost him something real and lasting, water and grazing, and the goodwill of a man who held paper over half the town. Then he's a fool to have sent for me at all, she said, quiet. Or the first sensible man in this county, Mrs. Prout said, seeing as a marriage bought with water rights isn't like to keep a man warm on a winter night the way a wife chosen for her letters might. But that's not my choice to make, nor yours to make for him. It's his, and he's already made it, riding out to that platform with a lame mare under him rather than wait for a fresher one. A man doesn't hurry like that for a bargain he regrets. She patted Ruth's hand once, brisk as she likely was with everything, and left her to her tea and her thoughts. Ruth had faced down worse than Louisa Fenn's sweetness in her 29 years, but she had never faced it 2,000 miles from anyone who loved her. in a town that had decided within an hour of her arrival that she was a joke to be waited out, and now carrying the added weight of knowing her presence might cost the one man who'd chosen her something as real as water in a dry season. And something in her, some reserve of pride she had been running on since the platform, finally cracked. She thanked Louisa with as much composure as she could gather, went up to her room, and sat on the edge of the narrow bed with her case still half-packed, and thought, for the first time since leaving Ohio, that perhaps the kind thing, the wise thing, would be to take that Thursday stage before she made a fool of herself in front of a whole town that had already decided what she was. She was still sitting there turning it over when Wade Howerin's voice came up from the boarding house stairs, asking Mrs. Prout, who kept the place, whether Miss Callahan might receive a caller. And Ruth wiped her face quickly and told herself sternly that she would not let him see she'd been anywhere near crying, and opened the door with her chin set the way it had been set on the platform. "Louisa Fenn's been to see you," Wade said. It was not a question. "I passed her on the street just now, looking pleased with herself in a way I've learned to be wary of." When Ruth said nothing, he added gentler, "I don't need to guess what she said. She's been telling anyone who'd listen for a month that I'd come to my senses and marry her instead, ever since her father got it in his head that our land and his money would sit well together. I never gave her cause to think it, but a woman set on believing a thing will believe it regardless of what a man's actually said." He studied Ruth's face a moment, and whatever he read there made his own expression harden. "You're thinking of getting on that Thursday stage." "I'm thinking a man deserves better than a wife the whole town's laughing at before the wedding's even happened," Ruth said. "I'm thinking you'd be spared a good deal of trouble if I simply went home." She made herself say the rest of it too, because Mrs. Prout had been right that she'd rather know a thing whole than half. "Mrs. Prout tells me Silas Fenn holds the note on your grazing lease, and that he meant his daughter to marry into it. I won't be the reason you lose water for your herd, Wade. That's not pride talking. That's plain arithmetic, and I've always been better at arithmetic than at pretending a thing isn't true." Something flickered across his face, surprise, she thought, that she'd learned of it so quickly, and then something steadier underneath the surprise. "Fenn's held that note 2 years, he said. "I've paid it regular and never missed, and there's not a clause in it that says I owe him my choice of wife along with my interest. If he's fool enough to call it due out of spite because I didn't marry to suit his ambitions, I'll find water elsewhere. The Tillmans have never loved Fenn's terms any better than I have, and there's talk of digging a second well on my own north section regardless. I'll not pretend it wouldn't be inconvenient. But I've built this ranch up from raw grass with my own 2 hands once already, and I expect I could do it again if it came to that. Whereas I don't expect I'd ever again meet a woman who answered every hard question I asked her honestly instead of telling me what she thought I wanted to hear. I know which of those 2 things I'd rather keep." "I'll tell you what I'm thinking," Wade said, and something in his voice then was not gentle at all, but hard in a way she had not yet heard from him. Hard the way a fence post is hard, something driven deep and meant to hold. "I'm thinking I've spent 3 years being the most eligible bachelor in this county on account of my father's land, and watching half the women in it decide they loved me before they'd troubled to learn a single true thing about my character, Louisa Fenn chief among them. I wrote to a marriage bureau instead of courting local, because I wanted a wife who'd chosen me for my letters and not my acres, and your letters were the only ones that answered a single question I actually asked, instead of telling me what a fine catch I was. I don't aim to lose that woman to a boarding house full of gossips on her very first day, and I'll be obliged if you'd let me say so to the whole town myself, rather than climbing on a stage before I've had the chance." Ruth studied him, this plain-spoken rancher with his sun-lined face and his steady eyes, who had ridden to meet a train despite a lame mare, and stood between her and a platform full of laughter without being asked, and felt something in her chest loosen that had been clenched tight since Ohio. "And how do you mean to say so?" she asked. "I mean to marry you before sundown," Wade said. "In the church, with the whole town invited whether they come to celebrate or to gawk, because either way they'll see it done, and know it was no mistake. I'd meant to wait the week, do it proper with the banns read twice more, but I find I'd rather 9 Mile understood plainly today exactly where I stand, than spend a week watching Louis Fenn work at pulling you apart from the inside while I stood by being patient about it." He held out his hand, not quite touching her. "That's if you'll have me, Ruth. I know a rushed wedding isn't what either of us pictured writing those letters, but I'd rather rush it and keep you than wait a proper week and lose you to a town that doesn't deserve the keeping of you." She thought of the women laughing on the platform, of Louis's sweet, cruel smile, of 2 long weeks alone on a rattling train, telling herself she was plain and past hoping and had long since made her peace with it, and found, looking at Wade Howerin's outstretched hand, that she did not want to make peace with plainness any longer. She wanted, instead, exactly what he was offering, to be chosen, in front of everyone who had already decided she wasn't worth choosing. "I'll have you," she said, "before sundown and not a minute later, so 9 Mile has plenty of daylight left to talk about it, and plenty of time still to grow tired of talking before supper." She spent the hour before the wedding in her room at the boarding house, being fussed over by Mrs. Prout, who pinned her hair with more determination than skill, and declared the result fine regardless. And Ruth found herself thinking, oddly, of her sisters back in Ohio, who would no doubt hear of this someday by letter, and be scandalized that plain Ruth had married inside a single day, and who would never quite understand that being chosen quickly by a man who meant it was worth considerably more than being courted slowly by men who never had. She thought of her stepmother's cool assessments over the supper table, of years spent believing herself a burden dressed as a daughter, and found that the thought no longer stung the way it once had, because a man 12 miles from anyone had read her letters and wanted her plainly, and that was arithmetic even her stepmother could not have argued against. Word traveled through 9 Mile faster than Ruth would have believed possible for a town so small, and by the time she stood at the back of the little church in the one good dress she owned, her hair done up by Mrs. Prout's clumsy but well-meaning hands, the pews were fuller than Sunday service ever managed, packed with the same women who had laughed at her that morning, all come now to see for themselves whether Wade Howerin truly meant to make good on the rumor sweeping the town. Louis Fenn sat near the front in a fresh gown, her face arranged in careful pleasantness that did not quite reach her eyes, and beside her sat a heavy-set man in a fine dark coat, whom Ruth needed no introduction to recognize as Silas Fenn, watching the proceedings with the flat, assessing look of a man tallying a loss. He caught her eye once, on her way down the aisle, and did not trouble to disguise the coldness in it. "I understand congratulations are due," he said, low enough for only her to hear as she passed his pew, "though I wonder if you understand yet what you've cost him, coming out here uninvited by anyone but himself. Water runs short some summers in this country, Mrs. Halloran to be. I'd remember that, if I were you, before I got too comfortable in my new situation." It was said pleasantly enough that anyone watching would have seen only an old family friend offering a word of welcome, and Ruth understood in that moment precisely how a man like Silas Fenn had come to hold paper over half of 9 Mile without ever once raising his voice. "I understand a great deal, Mr. Fenn," Ruth said, keeping her own voice just as pleasant, just as quiet. "I understand that a note paid regular is a note in good standing, whatever the reason a man chooses his own wife for his own reasons. I understand, too, that a well dug on a man's own land answers to no one's spite, but his own patience in the digging. I find I'm not much afraid of arithmetic, Mr. Fenn." I've done a good deal of it in my life, and it generally comes out fairest for whoever keeps their word." She walked on before he could find an answer to that, and did not look back to see what his face did, because she found, to her own surprise, that she no longer needed Silas Fenn's opinion of her, nor his daughter's, nor the opinion of anyone else crowded into those pews to watch a spectacle. Wade stood waiting at the front looking, Ruth thought, considerably less composed than the man who had argued her out of a stagecoach that afternoon, his hands restless at his sides until she reached him, and he took hold of them like a man reaching solid ground. "You came," he said, quiet, just for her, as though some part of him had doubted it despite everything he'd said. "I told you I would," she said. "I don't say things I don't mean, Wade Howerin. It's about the only pretty thing anybody's ever said about me." "Then I'll say a truer one," he said, low enough that only she and the preacher could hear it, since apparently no one in this town's had the sense to say it plainly before now. "You're not plain, Ruth. You've got a face that means what it says, and a spine that doesn't bend for meanness. And I'd rather have both of those than every ribbon and curl in 9 Mile put together. I knew it on the platform this morning, watching you not flinch, and I've known it every hour since, and I expect I'll go on knowing it every hour for the rest of whatever years I'm given." Not everyone in those crowded pews had come merely to gawk. An old, bow-legged ranch hand named Cyrus Bates, who had worked the Halloran spread since before Wade was old enough to sit a horse alone, caught Ruth's arm gently as she passed and told her, in a voice too rough with feeling to disguise it, that he'd watched Wade write letter after letter that winter past, tearing up more drafts than he ever sent, and that whatever 9 Mile thought it knew about the matter, he for one was glad the boy had finally found a woman worth all that careful writing. It was a small kindness, but Ruth found she needed it more than she let on, and she squeezed the old man's weathered hand in thanks before walking on toward the front of the church where Wade stood waiting. The ceremony itself was short, the preacher clearly still catching up to the speed of the day's events, and when Wade kissed her brief and warm, and entirely too public for either of their tastes, given the church full of watching eyes, a portion of the congregation broke into applause that Ruth suspected was more relief at witnessing something scandalous concluded properly than any real goodwill toward her. But she found she did not mind even that, because Wade's hand was warm around hers, and the sun had not yet touched the horizon, exactly as promised. Louisa Fenn approached them near the church door as the crowd thinned, her composure only slightly worn at the edges. "Well," she said, "I suppose congratulations are in order." She looked at Ruth a moment longer than courtesy required, something almost like grudging assessment crossing her face. "You held your ground better than I expected, I'll grant you that." "I generally do," Ruth said, pleasant and entirely unbothered, and had the satisfaction of watching Louisa Fenn find, for once, nothing further to say. They walked out of the church together into a 9 Mile evening gone gold and soft at the edges, the whole gossiping town behind them settling, as towns generally did, into a new opinion to replace the old one. And Ruth Callahan, married before sundown to a man who had called her exactly what she was, and found it more than enough, thought that she had come 2,000 miles expecting, at best, a fair and practical arrangement, and had found instead a man who saw her plainly and wanted her anyway. Which she understood now, walking beside him with the whole sky gone rose and amber above 9 Miles dusty street, was not a modest thing at all, but the finest thing a woman could be given. "Regretting the rush of it yet?" Wade asked, as they reached the wagon that would carry her to what was now, impossibly, her own home. "Not for one moment," Ruth said, and meant it so plainly that he laughed, and helped her up, and drove her home slowly in the last of the light with the sound of 9 Miles church bell still ringing faint behind them. as though even the whole town itself had decided, by sundown, to bless what it had so freely mocked by morning. Silas Fenn did call the note due that autumn, exactly as Mrs. Prout had warned he might, and Wade paid it in full within the month, rather than give the man the satisfaction of a single missed payment, and set his hired men to digging a well on his own north section before the first hard frost. And by the following spring, the Howerin spread wanted for nothing Fenn's spite could take from it. Louisa Fenn married a cattle buyer from the territory capital within the year and moved away entirely. And if 9 Mile ever spoke of the matter afterward, it was mostly to note, with the particular satisfaction small towns took in being proven wrong, that Wade Hallerin's plain bride had turned out to have more grit in her than half the county combined, and that the well on his north section never once ran dry, not even in the driest years that followed. Ruth kept the letters he'd first written her in a small tin box on the mantel for the rest of her days, worn soft at the folds from reading, and told anyone who asked that she had crossed 2,000 miles expecting, at best, a fair bargain honestly kept, and had found instead a man who looked at a woman the whole world called plain and saw, without needing to be told twice, exactly what was there to love.